Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Jessica Capcar. I am the Communications Manager at the BBB serving Central Ohio. We're glad to have you with us today. I hope everybody's staying safe and sane in these crazy times that we're having. But we're glad to have you here today, and we're also glad to have Matt Curtin with InterHack joining us for this outstanding webinar. I think it's going to be some really great information, especially in the increasingly digital world that we're all kind of forced to be in right now. So we're really looking forward to all the information that Matt has to share today. I wanted to let you know that we are recording this webinar, so it will be available afterwards for your reference at trustlocal.org. So you can feel free to refer back to it there. We also are going to take questions, so feel free to type any questions you might have into the question box. We'll make sure that we save time to go through as many of those as we can. But with that, I think I'll go ahead and turn it over to Matt and let him get started.
Wonderful, thank you.
You're welcome.
So today what I want to do is talk about security, and we're going to talk about it obviously online, but not just in online applications, sort of our lives in cyberspace. And the way that I want to talk about that is first to talk about some basic principles, and we'll talk about some design decisions that we need to make in our businesses, in our lives, as well as with our technology. And then toward the end is when I want to talk more specifically about the kinds of things that we need to deal with as a policy matter and how we go about managing our day-to-day lives. So any questions that you have, please do type them in, because that's going to help us to figure out sort of in the end how I can make sure that we're applying the lessons and the policy issues to the kinds of concerns that you have sort of in a day-to-day operation. So with that, I want to propose three things, and these are all related, and they won't sound like they have a lot to do with security, at least in the beginning. The first is going to be that we have, we can have massive returns, and we have seen that in investment portfolios and so on. But the way that we typically get that is by having a massive concentration in risk. The kind of thing, there's a corollary actually that we'll talk about that's worth mentioning though, and that is in terms of flexibility, is that if you are building or supplying something without maintaining your own stock, it's a lot cheaper. You can save a lot of money, you can get better returns, but you're doing so at the expense of not being as resilient when it comes to interruption in your supply chain. So we've seen that sort of thing going on all over the place this year, as sort of an interesting corollary there. The follow-up to the massive concentration of risk allowing for massive return also means that when we have any kind of problem, that not only do we have losses, but we can actually have catastrophic losses. And we have plenty of experience that tells us how to avoid these kinds of problems, and we've known about this for decades. But the fact is that as a general matter, we just don't do it. And so we'll take a look at some examples of how this comes up, with the idea of getting us to start thinking about how we might apply some of these principles in our own lives. Because if we have 10 or 20 different people, we can ask them about the kinds of things that they're doing. And while there may be some similarity, the fact is we're all using different applications and all kinds of stuff. So the what button to push isn't really a very good way for us to get into security generally. So giving you an idea of sort of where I'm coming from here is that my firm, InterHack, engages in cybersecurity operations, and we also deal with electronic evidence. And so some of the sorts of things that we've dealt with over the course of a year include things like what we call red teaming exercises, where we are actually attacking a client site as if we're bad guys, working on getting into the system, seeing how we are getting detected and so on. And then also looking at technology, not just the what is it designed to do, but what else can we make it do, and how might that affect the way that people think about risk that they're bearing as a result of using this. We deal with regulatory issues, of course. A lot of what we deal with is also things that will wind up in the court system. So if you have someone who's stealing intellectual property, for example, my firm might be engaged to uncover evidence of that, to explain the evidence to the attorneys, to the court, to the jurors. And that also happens when we get into criminal issues as well. And that can open the door to some pretty interesting things, like whether procedures are being followed the way that they should, to make sure that everybody's staying within the limits of what they are authorized to do by law. So there's an obligatory quote. We always have to quote somebody from antiquity to tell us, how wise we can be with something. And this presentation is no different. What we're talking about is Lao Tzu. If you do not change direction, you may end up where you are heading. And so that's worth thinking about as we are talking about the way that we balance things in our businesses, the way that we're operating, is that if we are expecting something different, then we're going to have to change something about what we're doing day to day. So we're dealing today with massive adoption of IT, and that has been only accelerated, of course. We're doing this webinar online with technology instead of sitting here in person and doing it, which we would be, which would be what's happening otherwise. So we see this. It's been happening for quite some time, and this year, the response to pandemic has only accelerated that trend that was already taking place. And when you start taking a look at the number of devices that we have connected to the internet, you can see it's not just a matter of us spending more time online, doing more things online, but we have more stuff online. We're getting to a point now where it's very difficult to get an appliance and be able to turn the refrigerator on without having it ask for an IP address and so on. So we're talking about the number of devices that are connected to the network being massive, billions of devices, and it's something that is just projected to keep on going. And every trend shows that's going to be the case. It's not like we see anybody's reversing some of the decisions that they've made, where they started hooking things up to the net and decided to take them off. So what this means is that every time we're making a connection to something, we are now increasing the complexity, because it's not only the variables that I have to deal with on the thing in front of me, but now that thing is going to interface to something else, and I have to deal with all of the complexity of that thing that it's hooking up to. And then I have to deal with the complexity of the two of them interfacing with one another and every other thing that they're connecting to. And so what we have is massive connectivity. And that also means that the way that we can get information to us increases massively. That sounds wonderful in theory, but that also means that things that we do not want can also come to us through a increasingly large number of ways. This, obviously, when you get into things like data breaches and so on, if you take a look at the last decade's worth of breach activity, this is the sort of thing that you see. These are breaches that are being reported continue to increase. And what does that actually mean? Okay, another breach has happened. So what? Oh, congratulations, you've won another year's credit monitoring free. Well, is there more to it than that? Well, we have a lot of stuff going on in the cybersecurity market, and a lot of people get very excited when they see things like this. Oh, the security market is huge. That must be great in terms of the security that we have. Not necessarily so. Security products are not necessarily any more secure than anything else. And we've seen plenty of cases where security products wind up introducing vulnerabilities that otherwise would not have existed. And so, what are you actually dealing with when we talk about getting some kind of technology in place so that you can manage the risk that comes from technology that you have? Well, let's go back to an example from investment. If you've got an investment that you've made, then you want to hedge that investment so that in the event that it goes south, you're not going to suffer as great a loss. And in the event that you want to do that, the question is going to be, how would you hedge that bet? Are you going to do so based on something that is correlated to the bet that you've made? Are you going to do so on something that's completely independent of what's there? Or are you going to hedge it based on a derivative of the same bet that you've already made? Well, really interesting thing is if it's based on a derivative of the bet you've already made, you're massively going to increase your returns. And you can see this kind of stuff. Oh, you get hockey stick. Like, this is fantastic. Look at all of the money that we're making. But when you put these things in context, it can sometimes tell a very different story. And that's the sort of thing that we need to think about, is that we're not just looking at riding the wave up. We ultimately, in our businesses, we own the decision. We own the consequences of whatever decision we've made and how we've managed the situation. So it's important for us not to think in very, very short terms or only on a transactional basis, but in terms of our position overall. What is going to happen in the event that things don't turn out the way that we hoped? So, the example of Enron, a lot of people say, well, that's not fair because that was fraud. That is not what tanked Enron. What Enron had going on was not illegal. The issue was the way that that Enron was able to get capital. They backed it with their stock. And so as a consequence, what you have is, well, we're backing it with the stock. It's fantastic. As long as the stock is going up, then everything will be fine. But the problem is when somebody wants the money back and you've backed it up with the stock, well, okay, you have to give them their money back. And of course, that drives the stock price down, which means you're going to hit your margin calls, which means you have to give up more money, which means that you're now going to have more margin calls. So you have to give up more money. And that's how you wind up having a crash so quickly. It's not illegal. Did I say that before? It's not illegal. And the issue here is one of bad risk management. So it does not follow that because something bad happened, it was illegal. The fact of the matter is that all of us in our businesses and in our lives day to day have a lot of decisions to make. And it does not follow that if something goes wrong, then we did something improper or illegal. So when we take a look at an example like Enron that is just so evident that there was a problem there, we need to think a lot about what lessons we can learn from that. The real critical issue here is that we have an increasingly large amount of interconnectivity, and we are expecting these things to happen in a particular way. We're expecting the technology to behave a particular way. And if it doesn't, then does that mean that we're going to be relying on technology to stop that from happening? Are we in fact using the same thing that we are, that we're betting on? Are we using that to hedge what happens if things go badly there? That's a good question for us as we start looking at how we're actually managing risk. I like this example about Uber. Probably most of you have heard about the former chief information security officer at Uber. Not only did they have this issue with their data breach, but then there was a subsequent data breach, and it turns out there was, we have a bugs bounty situation. Well, the former CISO has been charged with a crime, an actual crime, and that's going to be very interesting to watch. It's ongoing litigation, so I'm not going to comment on it further, but it does highlight that the stakes for this sort of thing are, in fact, quite real. Of course, there is also the Equifax breach. This was also a couple of years ago, but I still like to use this one because it's the kind of thing that affected you, it affected me, it affected almost everyone in the United States. And the question is, how many of us do business with Equifax? So whether you like it or not, They're compiling information about you. They are monetizing information about you. And they are making money based on their ability to get more and more information about you. Yet, when there is a failure, who is it that owns the risk? Well, now it's your information that's exposed. It's my information that is exposed. And what does this actually mean for us in terms of how we are managing systemic risk? That's a very important question for us, and again is very instructive when we get into the question of how we can protect ourselves and our businesses. This raises a question. Is security just impossible? Is it really that difficult? We've had people, very smart people, doing security for a long time. How is it that we continue to do this so badly? Well, there's a couple of things that I think are worth pointing out here. And one of the things is just vendor hype. When we're talking about any kind of technology, they talk about the stuff as if it's going to be miraculous and change everything. The reality is that no one technology tends to do that. What we see is that the little technology change here, the little technology change there, the way they interplay can have a pretty massive effect. But vendors will hype up their part of the puzzle, of course, and security vendors will also set unrealistic expectations in the same way by saying, well, if you don't have my product, then you are going to fall victim to this or that. So that's a real problem when it comes to the vendors and the products and services that are available, so that when we're in business making decisions, we're not really sure what it is that we're dealing with. We don't know what we can actually trust. And of course, when it comes down to it, we have to make some decisions. What are we going to buy? And very often, the low bidder wins. And so anytime that you want to know why there is a problem, the question is going to come up, well, how much cheaper was the solution that you selected by comparison to the next one? Those are reasonable questions. The last thing in this part of dealing with the question of why things are insecure has a lot to do with the event horizon, as I call it. So it's very short term. We're not thinking about something about 10 years from now. We're not thinking about something even next year, maybe. In a lot of cases, we're trying to get through the present audit. We're trying to get inspection that comes as part of a process of contract negotiation. We're just trying to make it around the next corner. And that, as a consequence, means that we could well be setting ourselves up for a much bigger problem later on down the road. Now, we've talked about the kinds of principles that do exist, that we've known how to address a lot of these problems. For more than 40 years, we've known how to do this. And the fact is that many of the systems that we are using still today do not implement these principles. Now, these are engineering principles, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. I'm not expecting that I'm talking to an engineering crowd, but these principles are worth knowing and we're thinking about, because we, of course, in business are going to have similar kinds of concerns. It's going to be to do with the policy, the mechanism that we're using for getting business done, as opposed to some kind of technology. The principles, nevertheless, are the same. So one of the things, of course, is that we say, well, we've got IT people for this sort of stuff. But the fact is that these are not IT problems. Almost never are we talking about something that is just an IT problem. And that is very important for us to think about, because if we do think of it as an IT problem, the question becomes, how do the people in IT think of it? And if we think it's an IT problem and they think that it's a funding problem or some kind of management priority problem, we immediately have a misalignment of expectations, and that never is going to work out in our favor. So what that means is that when we're in business, whether we are the CEO, whether we're somewhere in middle management, or whether we're a frontline supervisor, security is our problem. If we are staff just working on, in a clerical position, we're answering the phones, we're talking to customers, we're doing the business. to take care of people and to get that job done, security is our problem. All of us have to do something about security. Now, a lot of people say, well, security is everybody's role, it's everybody's job. Well, when we actually put it in those terms, it's important to remember that making it everybody's job means that it's nobody's job. So what we're saying is that each of us has a role to play in the security of the organization. So our job might be to handle information, and the way that we do that job can be to protect it or to expose it. Our infrastructure is the same way. We can either protect it or we can expose it. So when we're looking at how we can actually go through this process, there's a few things that I want you to think about. I'm going to mention a security principle. It's going to apply to people, it's going to apply to processes, and it's going to apply to technology, the tools that we are using as we go about our day-to-day work. And we'll go through these very quickly, and then we'll start talking about applications. So getting serious about security is something that is a decision. We have to think about that, and we have to decide we are going to get serious about security. So it's not a matter of getting compliant. It's not a matter of being able to check some boxes so that the counterparty of the contract that we want to enter into will actually sign on the dotted line. What we're talking about is thinking about what bad thing can happen. If you don't think about that, if you don't want to visualize that, if you don't want to engage with what bad thing can happen, then you are not serious about security. You must envision those bad things, because then you can figure out how to apply the principles in your own case and how to protect yourself and your organization. So start out with, what does a bad day look like? What does a bad day look like for you? What does it look from there? That helps you to understand what incentives you have. So when you're looking at things like a proposal for some kind of a business deal, or when you are trying to make a decision on what to buy, things like the price point, of course, is important. You need to think about things like, how are you evaluating security? I've got 100 points that I need to divvy up here to figure out which of these things I'm going to select. And is security 10 points, 5 points, 30 points, 50 points, 100? There is such a thing as too much security, and that's a different security, so much on defense that you have nothing to defense work either. There must be some balance. And the right balance is going to depend on your organization. A bank, for example, is going to have a less risky position because it's important that they stick around for a year, 2 years, 10 years, 100 years. A startup company, on the other hand, has a much greater appetite for risk. It doesn't matter necessarily so much that the startup company is here in 10 years. What matters is they make the returns. If they make the returns, then they can be here in 10 years. Those are examples of how we can have two different organizations, both run by perfectly rational people that are making very different decisions in terms of how much risk they are willing to bear. So the principles that we're going to talk about are the Sulzer-Schroeder design principles. And we'll just go through each one of these things. I'll mention what they are and what an application is. And as I'm doing so, think about what that means to you in terms of your people, your process, and your technology. The economy of mechanism. I love this because we have to think about, when we are doing something, how complex is it? Do we have to push a lot of buttons? Do we have to log into something? How much clicking around do we have to do? How difficult is it to work? Is it a Rube Goldberg contraption for us to get something done? Or is there something that's very easy? And sometimes the things that are very easy don't seem like they should work. And I'm reminded of something I learned from Senior Chief Petty Officer Don Shipley. If it's stupid, but it works, it ain't stupid. especially in smaller organizations, we tend to think a lot about, well, what is everybody else doing? How do the big guys secure their systems? I feel very inadequate about my own security. Sometimes some dumb little thing that you can do can make a big difference. So, think about what could you be doing in those situations. The default action is a big, big deal. And we see this a lot now in social media. There's been a lot of writing about this, where the idea is, how do you nudge users into doing things that you want? And a lot of the testing that's been done, where you show half of your audience one ad, you show the other half of the audience another ad, and you see which one people respond to more. You show them something that is emotionally charged. You show them something that is rational. You see how they compare, with it. How does that affect the level of engagement in the platform? How much are you able to wring from them that you can monetize? Those are the kinds of things that we see. That's all about having defaults that get people to do what you want. In security, we have the same thing. So we have to think about, well, what's the default action? What if I take no action? What happens? Now, the railway signal is a really good example for this, because these signals, they go up and down. They have things that are going to show the train what's going on. But what happens if the cable that controls those signals breaks? If the cable snaps, then what will happen is there's nothing to hold those signals up, so they will drop. And when they will drop into a position that will say stop. That's how we prevent trains from crashing into one another when you have a faulty signal. Can we do the same kinds of things in our businesses so that the default action is not to act and to cause somebody to have to look at something to re-enable something instead of just pressing on with it? Complete mediation is where somebody or something has access to data. So basically, the idea is that every time you go in to look at something, you're going to be challenged. Are you you? Do you have authorization to do this? You can build that kind of mechanism in place. And we do this with passwords, for example. And if we have layered authentication, then that obviously helps a great deal. But this helps us to make sure that when we are going into anything sensitive, every time we're logging into the bank account, every time that we are accessing the money, every time we're going into a sensitive file, every time we add a signer to any of the things on the business, that we are doing so in a way that is going through a known process. It's going to create a log. It's going to create a means to validate that, yes, this is the right person, and that that person does have the necessary rights to take care of whatever it is they're asking to do. Sometimes people like to try to protect things by hiding them, by making things secret. And the problem is that security through obscurity isn't. Open design is one of the principles. Everybody knows how a tumbler lock works, or they can find out how it works. It's not a secret at all. The reason why we can get some security from a tumbler lock is because the particular key is what is the secret. So the mechanism is not secret, but there is a secret, and that happens to be the shape of the key. So this is the kind of thing that we can think about as we are trying to figure out how do we protect things. It's not going to be necessarily the process that is a secret, but maybe we can inject something so that only the people who are involved know this. A way to authenticate mutually, for example, is I think a good example of this. One of the scams that's been going around a lot is you get this email that purports to be from the boss to say, hey, I need you to go to the Apple store and go get these $90 worth or $900 worth of Apple cards or whatever, blah, 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 blah. And it's obviously not actually from the boss. It's from somebody who's cruising the website, gets the boss's name, and makes the impression. Now, if your design for any of that sort of stuff is such that you have a way to authenticate one another, well, the design of the organization is open. You know who the boss is, you know who the subordinate is, but the fact that there is a way for them to interact with one another such that there is a secret that exchanges. You have to use the secret word if you're going to get me to move money around, Mr. Boss Man. That's the kind of stuff that we're talking about where open design can be very helpful. Now, this complements other principles like the separation of privilege. And of course, we see this in organizations all the time. You know, banks have things set up so that, you know, you have to have several different people do something. We might have an organization where several people have to sign checks over a certain amount of money. The government has been set up with separate co-equal branches so that we don't have any one that's able to run roughshod over the other. And so, yes, the president is the commander in chief, but Congress holds the purse. And so there's a lot of that kind of a back and forth that's in there. And it can slow things down, of course, but it does make for a more resilient system. And ultimately, it helps us with security. Combine that with the principle of least privilege, not giving somebody the right to do absolutely everything because they need to do something. So that means that you know, you bring somebody in and into the business, and their job is to answer the phones and to take messages and to get the mail and to put it in the right mailbox. That's probably not somebody that you need to give the keys to the safe to. Those are the kinds of things that we think about. What role does this person have? And is there a way to limit how much that person is able to do? Most of us think about this sort of thing intuitively, and we start out that way. But as we continue to work with people and their roles change, we don't tend to think of their roles changing as much as they become additive. So they get new privileges every time, but we never actually take away any of the old ones that they don't need anymore. And this can be quite a big problem. The least common mechanism, this basically gets down to, you know, how much is going to rely on any one thing. This particular thing here, this is something that belongs to a helicopter, and it is sometimes called the Jesus nut. If that thing goes in a helicopter, you've got really big problems. It is a single point of failure. Everything depends on that. It is a common mechanism. So when we're designing things, the question is, how much stuff do we have all going through a single point of failure? Is that a good thing? Is a bad thing? Well, it depends on what we're doing with it. We have to think about what the intended result is and envision that bad thing, what could happen there? Do we have a way to protect against it? Of course, we are dealing with people. So we can come up with all kinds of policies and technology requirements, just all kinds of stuff. We can make it so that the passwords are going to require a number, a letter, a capital letter, a space, a special character, the blood of a virgin. But that doesn't mean that it's going to give us the intended result. Psychological acceptability is very important. If we make things too difficult for people to get their job done the way that we want them to get it done, then they're going to get the job done some other way. They are going to do what they are paid to do. They're going to get paid to do what we inspect. And so they are going to get that job done. But if we make it difficult to get it done properly, we're going to be very unhappy with the way that it goes about getting done. And probably we're going to find out about it at a time that's especially inconvenient. So we've kind of run through these principles very quickly, just sort of trying to give you some ideas about what's going on here, because I'd like to open up a little bit of discussion and answer some questions that will be very specific to, you know, the particular situations that you're facing. So as we start getting into that sort of territory, there's a few takeaways, some questions that I would like for you, whether it's part of the discussion here or whether it is something that you take away and go back and deal with later in the office, is going to be, you know, what is it that we have here? Now, if you are already in security and you're looking at this, then your perspective is going to be very different from if you are a business owner, a business manager, which is what I'm expecting we're dealing with today. You don't need to know all of these security principles. What you need to know is a couple of things. Who is your security officer? There's got to be somebody who can help you with security. Is it you? Yeah, the buck stops with you if you're the CEO, but does that mean that you should not have anybody who's able to help you to understand what those issues are and how to manage them? Um, there's a thing about this. There's been a lot of talk about experts lately, and I don't want to get into the details of that debate, except to say this: an expert is not somebody who owns the decision. An expert is somebody who understands very little very well. And so that person is going to be able to describe the implications of a decision. But that person, by virtue of having trained in a particular area, is just not going to have had the time to study other areas. And so, as a business leader, you need to make decisions that are going to have to balance one thing versus another. So, two experts might be completely legitimate, they might be excellent, they can be credentialed, they can have the best of intentions, and yet have opposite advice. And that's because they are answering from the perspective of their own discipline. And so, of course, somebody is going to advocate for whatever it is that they're doing. That's what you want. And the business is going to own that risk. And that is the business leader's job, is to decide in this situation, which of these things are we going to do? And it may, in fact, be a combination. It might be something that makes everybody unhappy. But that's the sort of thing that you need to think about. So a security officer is not somebody that you cede all of that decision making to. It's somebody you can talk to help you understand what the implications are of a decision. If I choose A versus if I choose B, what bad thing can happen? Um, and in a lot of cases, you have to make that decision. Which bad thing am I going to want to deal with if things do go wrong? So, knowing who your security officer is, defining such a person is very important for you to be able to keep your head out of thinking about every bad thing that can happen. And you can be thinking about what good things can happen and how to make sure that you balance all of those things as a business leader. So understanding that means that you know what you don't want to have happen. And so it's not just about thinking about the good days. It's, what those bad days can look like as well. And the security officer should be able to help you with a lot of those things. But again, their view is going to be relatively narrow, unless their purview is very, very broad. If you're thinking about somebody talking about IT security, for example, they're typically not going to talk about risk of an investment portfolio. They're typically not going to talk about the risk of entering into one line of business versus another, something that's very labor intensive, something that's very capital intensive, versus something that has, well, maybe the returns are a lot lower, but you don't have to make those big investments up front. Those are decisions that somebody else is making, not the IT security person. So sometimes you're going to have to take some money from one so that you've got the ability to fund the other, so that in turn you've got enough to fund the first thing again. What else can this thing do? This is a great question. We see all of this stuff like security cameras are the example that I like to use a lot. People think of these things as devices that add security. It's a security camera. What could go wrong? Well, when we get engaged by a school system and we're able to take control of the security cameras, and I can do things like point the cameras down hallways the way that I like. When I can point them in creepy directions, that's something. But what if I'm using it to case the place? What if I've taken control of the security cameras for a company, and I can use that to figure out things like when the security guys are doing their rounds, or where people tend to congregate, or when they go there, or what the patterns of traffic are in particular hallways, and I use that to plan my burglary. Those are the kinds of things that we have to think about, not just what is this thing advertised to do? What am I going to do with it? The question is, what else can it do? What else can someone do with it in a way that I might not be very happy about? Good questions for us all to consider. So those are the things that I want you to be able to take away from this presentation, and I hope we've got some questions that we can get into that will talk about some of the specifics about how we might apply some of those principles. So, while you're thinking about that, and maybe you're cooking up a question, I'm going to seed it with a question of my own. And that is, if you are thinking about you're just getting away from the office, you're not doing any more work, you're tired, I have had it, I'm just going to go see what's happening with my family. So there I am on Facebook, and I'm just scrolling through all the stuff that's out there, and I'm seeing pictures of the kids and the cousins and grandma and everything else going on. And they put one of these things, which one of the founding fathers are you? And you click on that, and they start you down this series of questions that is going to tell you ultimately that you're Thomas Jefferson or Betsy Ross or whoever. Are you presenting any risk to yourself? Are you presenting any risk to your organization? That's the kind of thing that a lot of us might not think about. It seems like a relatively innocent diversion. And in fact, these things tend to be. If we were to put these things onto flashcards or onto index cards, and we take somebody through these, this can be kind of a fun little thing that we might do with our friends sometime. But when we do this online, we have to remember we're not just having a conversation with our friends. We have not paid for that platform. When you are not paying for the product, you are the product. What that means is that you are having a conversation ostensibly with your friends. Hi, look at me, I'm Thomas Jefferson. Or you can look at it a little bit more detail. You are having that conversation through a medium that is paying attention to that conversation. They are listening in on your conversation. They are recording every answer that you are providing. Now, you might think this isn't a big deal, but when you get into some of these quizzes and they ask you things like, okay, well, what street did you live on when you were in grade school? In what city were you born versus where you live now? And so on. At some point, you can realize these are the same questions that security questions will come up when I'm trying to do business with the bank or I'm trying to reset a password. If we give away that kind of information about ourselves so that we can have some website tell us which one of the founders we are, then we are in fact opening ourselves up by virtue of being fiduciaries, by virtue of having responsibility in our organizations. We're opening our organizations up because the information that we give away about ourselves can be used to impersonate us. So that's one of the kinds of things that we need to think about, and the reason why security is dependent on privacy. This is something that a lot of people will say things like, oh, we have to make these decisions about how we're going to balance security versus privacy. We have to give the police the ability to read our email and so on. That's an absolutely terrible idea, because if the police can do it with authority, it means that they can do it without authority. Regardless of your position on whether Edward Snowden did the right thing by releasing publicly information about NSA's domestic surveillance program, the fact is that it has been ruled illegal. A massive program that costs billions of dollars, done completely in the dark and completely illegally. That's a pretty big deal. And so the question is, does it make us any safer? Well, the reality is that if somebody can do it legally, somebody can do it illegally, as we have seen. And if our own intelligence agencies can do it, what's stop some other intelligence agency from doing it, or a corporation from doing it and having a data breach that leads to exposure that can get into systemic problems? So there's a lot of these things that are interconnected that are important for us to think about, and the reason why we need to take this stuff seriously. So security can be a serious business, but if we think about it and engage with it, then while it is unpleasant sometimes, we can at least do so on our own terms, on our own schedules. And if we try to hide from it, then what we're going to find is it's going to come to get us, and then we are going to be in a mode of constantly reacting, never being able to get in front of it. So grab it, take control of it, make the decisions. Sometimes they're going to be wrong, but you've decided and you can move on. You can recover from incidents. That's something that is worth talking about another time. All right. That was my question to seed myself. Any other questions that anybody
Well,
might have?
thank you, Matt. It doesn't look like we have any questions right now, but again, if anybody does have questions, please go ahead and type those into the question box and we'll be happy to pass those along. But again, I wanted to remind everybody that we did record this webinar, so you can reference back to it. We'll have it on our trustlocal.org website, as well as our YouTube page, so you can feel free to take a look at that there if there was something that caught your ear and you want to refer back to. But again, if there aren't any questions, I just want to thank Matt again for this outstanding information and for your time today. And just want to say thank you to all of our attendees. And I think we'll go ahead and end our afternoon there, if that's all right.
All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Matt. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.